I'm hoping that today is going to be our last presentation on soft body armor. This is a subject that's becoming tired, and to be blunt, I'm running out of 3A body armor. I'm also running out of colorful metaphors to describe some of the inane questions people have about what if it's hit with this or that type of projectile. But with all those inane questions also come some very legitimate questions, and I want to address two of those today. Now, before I get into the specifics of that, let me give you a little bit of background of this type of body armor. Generally speaking, this soft body armor gives you greater protection from large diameter projectiles than it does from small. Also, generally speaking, it gives you greater protection from low velocity rounds than it does from high velocity. And also, it gives you greater protection from blunt-nosed projectiles like a wad cutter, more so than spear point projectiles like Full Metal Jacket spear point, or even a ballistic tip is still pointy. Now, with those things in mind, that's why this type of body armor performs very well against typical handgun calibers like 9x19, 40 Smith & Wesson, 45 ACP, when they're fired from handguns of typical barrel length. But this type of body armor fails when it's hit by things like 5.7x28, 5.56 NATO, or 7.62x39. Those type of cartridges have the right combination of relatively small caliber, high velocity, and quite often a spear point type projectile. Now, with that kind of thing in mind, there's this concept that keeps coming up all the time. Well, what about a .22 long rifle? Now, that's not particularly high velocity, but your typical 40 grain projectile out of a .22 long rifle is round nose. It is kind of a little bit pointy, I guess, and it's certainly small caliber. And the rumors that this type of body armor can be penetrated by a .22 long rifle go back as far as I started hearing that kind of thing when I was in the 2nd grade. I heard people say, this will stop a .44 Magnum, but it won't stop a .22. Yeah, that ranks right up there with questions like, can it stop a bullet that's fired from the horn on a unicorn's head? But we'll put it to the test anyway. But on the heels of that also comes a very legitimate concern when people ask about, what about a .22 Winchester Magnum rimfire? Now, that's certainly small diameter, and it has a lot higher velocity than a .22 long rifle. And I think that's a very legitimate question. Another question that's come up recently is, although we know that this will stop the projectiles from 9mm or 45 ACP, what happens if we up the velocity of those by putting them in a pistol caliber carbine? Will we then give those cartridges enough velocity to penetrate this body armor? Now, that's a good question, and we'll put that to the test today too. Now, here's our 3A body armor, and here's you. I've got my Ruger single 6 with a 9-inch barrel, .22 long rifle loaded with CCI mini mags, and will shoot from 7 yards. Now, this comes with a disclaimer. Sometimes even when a projectile does not penetrate this body armor, it has enough concussion to crack the soda bottle behind it. So if you see any soda leaking, reserve judgment until we do the neck rod. Now, you saw some red soda spewing, but there is no bullet hole in this jug. The concussion just cracked it a little bit right there. And all 4 of those projectiles were stopped by this 3A body armor. Now, let's reset this up and try this with a .22 Magnum. Now, I've got the same revolver, but I've changed cylinders. This is now loaded with CCI Maxi Mag .22 Winchester Magnum rimfire. For those of you who are not familiar with this cartridge, let me show you a close-up of it. The cartridge on your right is a .22 long rifle. The one on your left is a .22 Winchester Magnum rimfire, commonly referred to as a .22 Magnum. And you can see it's a lot bigger and it's a lot more powerful. Now, in a previous presentation, I chronographed .22 long rifle and .22 Magnum through this revolver, so I'm not going to rehash that here today. Suffice it to say that .22 Magnum is a lot more powerful. So I'm going to go back 7 yards, shoot our body armor, and we'll see what happens. Now again, you saw the soda spewing, but in the case of this one, that's where the concussion put a little crack on it. But in the case of this bottle here, 1 of the 5 rounds I fired most certainly did go through. So it stopped 4 out of 5 rounds. That's pretty good, but certainly not perfect. And that tells us a lot about 3A body armor, and it also tells us do not underestimate a .22 Magnum. Now, as far as the question of whether or not a pistol caliber carbine can penetrate the 3A body armor, the first thing I want to know is just how much more velocity is the carbine giving you over the pistol? Well, I've got the chronograph set up at 7 yards, and we'll start with the Beretta 92FS. I've got it loaded with Remington green and white box 9x19 115 grain metal case. Remington calls it metal case. And we'll see what kind of velocities we're getting. Then I'll repeat this with the carbine and see just how much, if any, velocity we gained. (1065), 1084, 1066, 1054, 1056. Now let's try that with the carbine and see if there's any difference. Now for a carbine, I'm going to use my Beretta CX4 Storm rifle. It has a 16.5-inch barrel, and it's loaded with the same Remington green and white box 9x19 ammo. 1265, 1277, 1255, 1243, 1254. That seems like quite a bit more. Now let's see what kind of differences there are between rifle and pistol when we're talking about 45 ACP. I've got my Colt government model loaded with Remington green and white box 230 grain metal case. 803, 813, 803, 805, 803 again. Now let's see how that compares to a rifle. Now this is my Para-Ordnance Tommy gun, the closed bolt semi-auto version. It has a 16.5-inch barrel, and it's loaded with the same Remington green and white box 45 ACP ammo. 956, 919, 929, and 915. Now let's go crunch the numbers. So how'd we do? Well, of course, there's the caveat that chronographs don't always agree with each other, and certain environmental factors can affect chronograph results. But the numbers we got were with the 9mm a mean velocity of 1065, and when we switch to the carbine, that becomes 1258, a mean gain of 193 feet per second. That's significant. Now with the 45, we get a mean velocity of 805. And when we go to the carbine, it becomes 929, so a mean gain of 124 feet per second, which is also significant. And when you take into account that we're talking about a 230 grain bullet, then that gain in velocity is a lot. But the real question is it enough gain in velocity to penetrate our 3A body armor? Let's find out. So once again, we've got our body armor taped to this white barrel. It has some give. You'd have some give if you were wearing it. I'll go back 7 yards, shoot it with the CX4 Storm rifle, and let's see what happens. So how'd we do? Well, I fired 4 shots. The 2 that hit center mass went through. The 2 that hit on the edges where the body armor's wrapped around the barrel a little bit, so they're really more of a glancing blow, they did not go through, but they came very close to going through. And you got to remember the ammunition I'm using is not particularly powerful 9mm ammo. So your 3A body armor so far doesn't look like it's standing up to a pistol caliber carbine all that well. But let's try the 45. Well, the first shot did not go through, but it tore our vest off, so I've got some new tape up. Let's go back and shoot another shot. Well, we shot the 3A body armor with 3 rounds of 45 ACP, and it stopped all of them. It would appear that the 45, having significantly greater diameter than the 9mm and a lot less velocity, it doesn't stack up real well against 3A body armor, even in a carbine. But as I said, that wasn't particularly powerful 9mm ammo. Well, that also was not particularly powerful 45 ammo. So let's try something that is. Now I'm loaded with Hornady Custom 45 ACP plus P 200 grain jacketed hollow point. And I've got enough duct tape on my 3A body armor that it should stay on the barrel. So let's shoot this from 7 yards and see what happens.
Well, I was wrong about the duct tape, but it did stop that bullet. So I've got some new tape on here now. Let's shoot another round and see what happens.
Well, with the plus P hollow points, we shot this body armor twice and it stopped both bullets. Let me show you a close-up of them. And there they are, and you can see that they mushroomed a great deal. So what can we take away from all of this? Well, we showed that 22 long rifle will not penetrate this type of body armor. I'm sure somewhere there was a case with defective body armor or something like that where 22 did, but for the most part, no, it's not going to. 22 Magnum, on the other hand, that is something to be concerned about. But at the risk of sounding redundant, this type of body armor is intended to stop conventional projectiles like Full Metal Jacket or hollow points fired from conventional handgun calibers such as 9x19, 40 Smith & Wesson, 45 ACP, in guns with conventional handgun length barrels, 2 inches, 4 inches, 6 inches. And it will do really well against those kind of things. But when you get outside of those parameters is where it starts to fail. And we see that for some pistol caliber carbines, they'll go through it. Now, it seemed to do really well against the 45, but the 9mm not so much. And about now is when someone asks about a 357 Magnum. Well, we didn't test that, but we can take it for granted that if a 9mm will penetrate, then a 357, which is shooting a bullet with a diameter that's virtually identical, but which is heavier and going a lot faster, will go through this type of body armor pretty easily. We also put to rest the question about projectiles fired from a unicorn's horn. Yes, 3A body armor will give you sufficient protection against that. However, you remember a cartoon called The Herculoids where they had a character called Tundro the Tremendous? He looked like a cross between a styracosaur, an armadillo, and a corgi. And there must have been several animals in there because he was a decaped. But he had a hollow horn that he fired these exploding rocks out of. Yeah, 3A body armor will not protect you against those. So, as always, don't try this at home on what you call a professional, and thanks for watching the pistol caliber carbine versus 3A body armor video.